folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.
Welcome to this special bonus episode of the History of New Orleans. Before we get started, I want to warn you that this episode will contain graphic descriptions of violence that may be disturbing to some listeners. If you do not think that you want to hear any of that, then feel free to skip this episode. You won't miss anything important to the overall narrative. Okay, with that disclaimer out of the way, let us dive into the infamous story of Marie Delphine McCarty, who commonly went by her middle name and later was known as Madame LaLaurie. Delphine was born in New Orleans on March 19, 1787, during the period of Spanish rule. Her family had lived in New Orleans since the 1730s, when her grandfather moved there from Ireland. Unlike the poor Irish immigrants who flooded into the city during Delphine's later years, her family was wealthy and well connected within the elite Creole community. Her uncle was Governor Esteban Miro, and her cousin on the other side of the family would be elected as mayor of New Orleans, as we covered in the main series. Growing up in a wealthy family in the 1790s in New Orleans meant that Delphine was undoubtedly in contact with both enslaved black people and free people of color. World events during her childhood would begin to tinge these relationships with fear, as the Haitian Revolution broke out when she was only 4 years old. The subsequent spreading of the revolution to the plantations surrounding New Orleans would only exacerbate this fear. The slave revolts we mentioned in the main series, those being the Minna Conspiracy, the Pointe Coupee conspiracies, and the German Coast Uprising, all made the slave-owning whites of New Orleans extremely apprehensive around people of color. Undoubtedly, they would tell terrifying stories about the violent atrocities committed by revolting slaves to their children in order to keep them in line. So Delphine was growing up in an atmosphere of fear and paranoia around people of color, but she was also being raised to occupy the proper place for a young lady belonging to a prominent New Orleans Creole family. This place was unfortunately the place of an object, to be sold to the most advantageous suitor at the earliest possible convenience. That time came earlier than we might expect, as in 1800, when Delphine was just 13 years old, she was married to her first husband, a Spanish royal officer who happened to be 22 years older than Delphine. 4 years later, Delphine, now 17, was pregnant with her first child when her husband was called to Madrid to serve as consul general for the territory of Orleans. Not wanting to leave his child bride alone to care for their first child, Delphine was forced to join her husband on the arduous journey across the Atlantic. But first, they would have a pit stop in Havana. Luckily for Delphine, in Havana, her husband suddenly died, and she, along with her newborn daughter, were allowed to return to New Orleans. Unfortunately for Delphine, there were no other options in life for a woman of her station than to be a prize for some wealthy man. Only 4 years after her first husband's death, she was married to Jean Blanc, a banker and lawyer by whom she would have 4 more children. Their marriage lasted twice as long as her first, but in 1816, Jean went the way of the first and died. Delphine was now 29 years old with 5 children and twice widowed. While there was no evidence or suggestion that either of her husbands had died of anything other than natural causes, Delphine was still not exactly the most desirable commodity in the patriarchal society of New Orleans. She had, however, managed to gain a bit more autonomy in her life, as her inheritance from her 2 husbands allowed her and her children to live in comfort despite being unattached. Finally, in 1825, Delphine married local physician Leonard LaLaurie, who was now her 3rd and final husband. Leonard was 23 years old when he married Delphine, 15 years younger than her. At this time, All but two of Delphine's children had moved on with their own lives, with her eldest daughter being 21 years old and thus prime age for marriage. Madame LaLaurie decided it was time she settled down, and so she purchased with her own money a plot of land at 1140 Royal Street, where she would build a mansion for her family to live in. During this time, Madame LaLaurie was an active member of New Orleans high society, where she participated in the balls and social events of well-to-do citizens, most of whom, like her, were slave owners. At these events and elsewhere in public, Madame LaLaurie was observed to be pleasant towards enslaved people, and often asked around about their health. This congenial image clashed with widespread rumors about how she treated her own slaves in private. It was impossible for the citizens of New Orleans to ignore how disheveled and emaciated her own enslaved people were, and the fact that there were 12 official cases of death of enslaved people at LaLaurie's mansion over the course of just 4 years raised suspicions even further. Now we must remember that the Creole people of New Orleans weren't exactly paragons of virtue when it came to the treatment of black people. In the main series, we went over how wealthy women in particular during this time period were known to alternate between kindness and cruelty on a whim. Even so, the purposeful mistreatment of enslaved people was outlawed in the city, even if it was rarely enforced. This anti-mistreatment law was a holdover from the relatively more progressive Spanish period, and was invoked at least twice with regards to the LaLauries. First, a case against the Madame of 1140 Royal Street resulted in no evidence of mistreatment being found, but since this was all subjective depending on the opinion of the investigating lawyer, who could have been paid off, we can assume that the verdict was less than truthful. The second case could not be swept under the rug as easily, since it involved multiple eyewitness accounts that stated they saw a young enslaved girl being chased by Madame LaLaurie with a whip until she tripped and fell out of a second-story window to her death. It resulted in 9 slaves being freed from Madame LaLaurie. This was only a temporary reprieve, however, since they were shortly repurchased by a third-party intermediary who promptly returned them to the LaLauries. What they returned to can only be described as hell on earth. Within the confines of LaLaurie's mansion, the enslaved people were subjected to torture of the likes we only see in the most hideous and draconic events in human history. The atrocities of the Haitian Revolution and the perverse medical experimentation and torture of the Holocaust, while much larger in scale, are the closest comparison that can be made to the cruelty that went on at 1140 Royal Street. The two most popular tellings of the stories are investigations of the abolitionist journalist Harriet Martineau in 1838 and the folk story popularized by New Orleans native Jean de la Vigne in 1946. Of the two, the latter is much more graphic, but even without accounting for the embellishment that is natural to ghost stories, the crimes were horrific. Martineau writes using contemporary first-hand accounts of what was found at the mansion in 1834, so her depiction is a bit more trustworthy, and while it is less graphic, it does corroborate that the cruelty dealt by the hands of the LaLauries was truly pure evil. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out at 1140 Royal Street. Neighbors and bystanders rushed into the mansion to put out the blaze and rescue anyone trapped inside. They first found an emaciated black woman chained by her ankle to the kitchen stove. It was her who had started the fire, and her excuse was that she did not want to live anymore. She was afraid that someday she would be taken to the attic of the slave quarters, where people did not come back from. This obviously intrigued the rescuers, and they demanded that the LaLauries give them the keys to the slave quarters so that they could save anyone trapped there. The LaLauries refused, so the crowd broke the door down. What they found inside were 7 people, suspended by their necks, who had obviously been experimented on by Dr. LaLaurie. Their limbs were stretched and broken. Some had chunks of flesh missing. Those who were still alive and could still speak told their rescuers that they had been chained up for months. Upon further investigation, the remains of some enslaved who had not been reported to the authorities were buried in the backyard. It must be said that New Orleans during this period was not alien to cruelty, slavery, and the dehumanization of black people. All these things were practically baked into the Creole society. But when word spread of the cruelty Madame and Dr. LaLaurie had subjected their slaves to, It sparked a riot. The parts of the mansions that were still intact after the fire were destroyed by an enraged mob, who did not at first believe the stories of how horribly these people were treated, but once they laid their eyes on the rescued slaves, they could no longer question it. Madame LaLaurie apparently never understood why the people of New Orleans were so angry with her. She had grown up hearing the stories of the horrors of the Haitian Revolution and how the slaves were just waiting for the first opportunity to turn on their masters and do what she had done to them. Her fear, her anger at how powerless she was over her own life, her dehumanization of her slaves, all combined with what can only be determined as a complete lack of empathy to create a monster, one whose story has become a prominent fixture in the tapestry of New Orleans' haunted folklore. People will always sensationalize the most shocking and horrific events of any place in order to attract interest. The story of Madame LaLaurie is so shocking and so horrific, not just because of what she did, but because of who she was. We have in our minds a picture of what a serial killer is. It is usually a man between the ages of 30 to 50 who is sexually frustrated or similarly mentally distressed. But Delphine LaLaurie was a rich, well-mannered mother of 5 who came from a well-regarded white family. In New Orleans, she was the equivalent of a princess or a duchess, a refined lady. This does not fit our assumptions about which people are capable of such terrible acts, yet the evidence stands for itself. Another way to contextualize the story of Madame LaLaurie is to see it not only as a real event that actually happened in New Orleans, but as an allegory for the antebellum South. Those who subscribe to the point of view that the Civil War was about states' rights and who hold the opinion that slavery wasn't all that bad, like to paint the pre-war South as this idyllic scene of aristocratic beauty, a society built on chivalry and good Western values, where every man had his place and the natural order of things was maintained beautifully. In their minds, the South is the porcelain-skinned, polite princess who couldn't hurt a fly. In reality, the South was Madame LaLaurie, a facade of beauty and dignity covering a creature of unspeakable cruelty. What is lost in the sensationalization of the ghost story of LaLaurie is that it was exceptional only in its graphicness. In New Orleans and across the South, from the very beginning of European settlement there was a constant oppression of people of color, barely hidden under a veil of civility. For almost 200 years, the powerful elites of New Orleans were all Madame LaLaurie.